to go to the moon and get paid and do the other things.
Weird. Weird.
You know, someone said that frickin' Panera's Pepsi's taste funny.
Better.
No, I mean,
What? Welcome, everyone, to an admittedly late new episode of the Average Intelligence Podcast. I apologize, running a little behind today, but there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on in this so-called big beautiful bill, and we are here tonight to basically cut through all the bullshit and tell you what's actually in this bill. But not only that, it's not as cut and dry as the Republicans are leading everyone to believe, because there were a lot of changes from its original incarnation, but also there are parts of this bill that are going to face major legal challenges if and when it becomes law, which seems like it's going to happen. But I digress. We will dig into it right now. But first, I want to let everyone know that this podcast tonight is brought to you by our friends at trophysmack.com and by our friends at Vizard.ai. We will talk about both of those a little bit later on, but we're going to break it down in order. So, let's see. So, a significant portion of this bill deals with things like agriculture, nutrition, and certain aspects of the welfare state. In Section 10101, also dubbed the binary section. What was that? Is it as much of an election loser as it looks? So here's the funny thing about this bill. Depending on who you ask, it's either a giant bucket of shit or it's the greatest thing ever. And the truth is, it's neither and both. It just here's my perspective on big bills like this. I don't like them. I just in principle, I don't like these giant pieces of legislation that have so much stuff, and there are so many parts of this bill that are only in there just to get votes and make one or two representatives and or senators happy. I think this is a horrible way to create legislation. And I still haven't figured out this XP thing, Justin, but you are in the lead. So yeah, I guess the best answer I could give you is maybe. We will find out. But so the binary section again. So part of this bill is reevaluating what's known as the Thrifty Food Plan, which is basically the food estimates that the government uses to sort of guesstimate um, how people get how much SNAP benefits. So food stamps, how much people get in food stamps. So part of this bill is it ensures that future cost adjustments to SNAP benefits are tied exclusively to CPI-U, which is the Consumer Price Index for urban consumers, rather than its current guide, which is the USDA's nutrition cost methodology. Um, I'll be honest, I didn't know too much about this, but I did check out both charts, and this seems really arbitrary, but the CPI-U does seem to be a little bit more thorough. But again, they're making vast generalizations, but you kind of have to with policy. So unless you have SNAP benefits, this probably isn't going to affect you at all. And even if you do, I don't think it's going to affect you that much. Of course, the Democrats are sounding the alarm about benefits being cut, and then Republicans are saying no. And the truth is, we probably don't know how this will affect SNAP benefits going forward until we get there. So the next section, 10102, modifies the SNAP work requirements for able-bodied adults. So there's been a lot of talk about this too, and the biggest thing that this does is it raises the age limit for work requirements from 54, I believe 59 in some states, but the federally 54 to 64. So basically, like in the most simplistic of terms, Basically, if you're an able-bodied adult with no dependents that qualify under these guidelines, you have to work a minimum of 80 hours per month as a part of receiving your SNAP benefits. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be a job. It could, the way I understand it, I've never had SNAP, so I don't know this, but based on what I've read, it could be something as simple as volunteering or job training that you can keep your eligibility that way. And also, states are now required to implement the new mandatory rules or lose federal funding as a result of error or not non-enforcement. And then speaking of SNAP, the next two sections, 10103 and 10104, they tie standard utility allowances only to households that receive energy assistance, whatever that means, and it places a cap on internet expenses deductions included in SNAP eligibility calculations. Like I said, I've never received these benefits, so I don't really know. I didn't know you could get utility. I knew you could get utility assistance, but I didn't know it was part of SNAP or anything like that. But I don't know. Like I said, if you're not receiving SNAP benefits, this probably won't affect you all that much, at least in the immediate. Now, one very interesting thing, Section 10107 establishes a grant program aimed at funding nutrition, education, and obesity prevention at the national level. Or you could just get rid of all the poison in our food. There's a thought. Yeah, we haven't heard too much about the MAHA movement, the Make America Healthy Again, but maybe. I understand that stuff takes time. Now, this might be one of the dumber sections. So, Section 10108, alien SNAP eligibility. This part of the bill restricts access to SNAP for non-citizens and newly arrived immigrants. Here's the thing. They already can't get welfare benefits unless they're refugees or qualifying asylees, which have meaning they've been granted asylum and now they have legal status in the country. Refugees also have legal status in the country. Now, this part of the bill seems very not vague, but it's redundant. It's saying a lot of the same things. So we'll get into some of the redundancies and the legal challenges. In this portion of the podcast, we're just going through what is in here, and then we will get to a more in-depth legal discussion. But first, we have to lay the foundation and know what we're talking about. Which, by the way, if you have anything to say, throw in the comments. Oh, Haley, I'm sorry, but this big, beautiful bill is less beautiful and more of a stupid bill, in my opinion. Yeah, as time goes on, there's a lot of stuff in here that is overly redundant. Like there are already laws on the books that cover a lot of this stuff, which I'm not surprised because I guarantee you the vast majority of Congress has never read this or those bills. So, speaking of which, though, if you do want to read this bill, you can. It's on Congress's website, and they have a nifty little feature where you can actually have it read to you. But this bill is huge, so I guess if you really want to fall asleep. But what do I know? I've actually watched C-SPAN for my own entertainment before. So anyway, health and Medicaid. Now, this is a really cloudy area of the bill because the fact of the matter is both parties are talking out their asses when it comes to how this will affect Medicaid because the bill is obscenely vague. There will be cuts, but a lot of the cuts are being mitigated at the state level, and there's a lot of back and forth. And as per usual, nobody knows what the fuck is going to happen, but everybody's yelling about it. So the parts we do know, though, is the bill does introduce Medicaid work requirements for non-disabled adults. So basically, if you're on Medicaid for financial reasons, but you're otherwise able-bodied, then you have work requirements similar to SNAP, which you probably already have work requirements for SNAP. And I would imagine that it's not like you have to work double. Like it's, as far as I know, it's the same sort of program. This includes children. This includes parents. Now, let me rephrase. This now includes parents who have children over the age of 14 This is known as the Crenshaw Amendment, and I can only assume that this came from Dan Crenshaw in order to get his support for the bill in the House. And federal funding of the affected states is tied to compliance, which again, that's already been dicey under the Trump administration, but we shall see. This bill also prohibits Medicaid from funding This bill prohibits Medicaid funding for abortion and gender affirming care starting in 2027. And we're going to dig into the problems here. First of all, Medicaid can already deny funding for abortion. That's already a thing. And 2027 seems like a long way off for a bill that's getting passed now. Um, you guys are just giving the Democrats something to run on a year later. It's almost like you're planning to lose. Like this is one of many things that starts in 2027, a year before an election year. I don't understand what they're thinking, but hey, I would say smarter people than me are behind this, but it's Congress, so who knows? uh, the bill also has a provision that accelerates eligibility redeterminations and increases cost sharing mechanisms to reduce coverage. So that's cuts. There are going to be cuts, and this is part of where a lot of Democrats are talking about people are going to lose their eligibility because they're changing the standards. So there's probably a lot of different things, and you're going to need to hire, much like your accountant, you're going to need to hire another person that speaks the same language you do to translate the paper that's in the language that you speak to you so that you can understand it. And there will also be penalties for states with higher error or fraud rates via funding cuts. So this is what most of the Democrats are screaming about. Yes, you're right, Justin. 2027 is a year after the midterms. So if they lose Congress, sorry, if the Republicans lose Congress, which I've already said this, good point, Justin, you get experience points. Sorry, someone has requested the link. I will send it to them. And check audio while I'm here. Bear with me one moment. So where was it? Yes. So if when the Republicans, because I'm gonna call this shot, when Republicans lose at least one House of Congress, although I believe they're going to lose both, um, this legislation is just going to be it's just going to be gotten rid of. Now Trump will have to sign a law without a two-thirds majority, so in all likelihood they will still lose at least one House of Congress. I think they're going to lose both, but they won't have a substantial enough majority to override Trump's veto. So a lot of this legislation will stay, but they will probably tie parts of other bills that are introduced to undercut this kind of stuff. So it's common. This is an exercise in futility. Like this is the definition of congressional stupidity, governmental stupidity, probably more accurately. Now, on to what this bill is really all about. So I'm kind of wondering why they're tying a bunch of stuff in together with it. And by the way, so the version we're going through here, there still may be some changes made to it, but this is the latest version that passed the Senate because there are some notes about things. Sorry, my brain has to go back to English because I just ran a spat it. Now I know I have. Ahora mi cerebro está en español. Yeah, so okay, this is the most recent version. This is the most recent version of the bill, which has not been signed into law yet. President Trump said he was trying to get this done by July 4th. It will probably be the following week, but maybe you never know. There was doubt whether this was going to pass the Senate, and they kind of managed to scrape it together at the 11th hour. But what this bill is really about is extending the Trump's tax cuts, which is funny. It's not funny, it's sad. So Trump and the Republicans have all been saying that they're going to make the tax cuts permanent. And that's what this bill was ostensibly all about. But the tax cuts are not permanent. And we'll dig into it. So it makes, even the synopsis, it makes permanent key tax cuts and Jobs Act provisions with extended individual rates, business depreciation, and estate thresholds until 2028. So it extends the tax cuts into 2028. Now, let's assume even the legislation says made it permanent. Here's the thing, there's no such thing as a permanent tax law because another Congress can always come in and change it. That's how Trump was able to do it. That's how Trump did the tax cuts anyway. They just changed the tax code. The tax code is a living, breathing document. Not breathing, you know what I mean. It's a living thing. It constantly changes. The child tax credit increased to $2,500 per child through 2028 in the House version, and apparently in the Senate version it's slightly lower, but it did not give me the amount. But so that's good for parents, especially economically, because kids are expensive. Uh, State and local tax deduction cap is now capped at $10,000 when the original House version of the bill had it capped at $40,000, which is basically people not paying state and local tax because they're getting it deducted off of their federal. Now, this bill also they kept this promise, it exempts tips and overtime pay from federal income tax and creates MAGA savings accounts with $1,000 annually tax advantage deposits per newborn until the law is changed or repealed. Now, I did see a video of AOC talking in Congress in the House today, and she was talking about how the tips and overtime pay exemption only goes up to $25,000 a year. I don't know. I couldn't see anything that said that, but I mean, I don't think she's lying about that. That would be a strange thing to lie about, but I digress. I'm not sure exactly what that provision is, although that makes sense because $25,000 in tips is actually a pretty substantial amount. Although I guess if you're making a waiter's wage, probably not. So yeah, to me, I think if you're not going to tax tips and overtime, then just don't tax tips and overtime hours. Just a thought. And the bill also introduces a 3.5% excise tax on overseas remittances. So it looks like the External Revenue Service will be a thing. So thus far, that's what we've got in the big beautiful. That's what we got in the big beautiful bill thus far. Now, yeah, the Republicans can have their big beautiful bill, but you can have something even better. You can have a big beautiful belt. Thanks to our friends at trophysmack.com. Look at these. Look at this guy. Every bit of 6 pounds, real metal, real leather. And the best part is you can custom design this bad boy whatever you want, whether you want silver, gold. When we first befriended Trophy Smack, they only had one custom belt design. They now have 6. So the sky's the limit. But here is a quick look from our friends at Trophy Smack. So yes, thank you to our friends at trophysmack.com. You should visit them today to get your custom belt, or maybe if you're not in the market for a belt, you can get a custom championship ring, custom trophies, wall art, so much more. And their prices are amazing, especially considering the quality you get. So click that link in the description and let them know that we sent you there, trophysmack.com. And we thank them again for sponsoring tonight's podcast. All right, the next provisions in the bill deal with defense and border security. So fun stuff. The bill allocates $150 billion in funding for defense, including, actually, I like a lot of this stuff. It, the, really? We're supposed to be professionals. The bill allocates an additional $150 billion for defense funding, including drone systems, including Trump's Golden Dome missile defense system, which one of these days you will, especially if you've challenged somebody to a fight, you'll win. Where was it? Oh yeah, the Golden Dome missile defense system, which okay, this might surprise some people. I actually like it. I like the idea of the Golden Dome missile defense system. And the reason being is because Israel's Iron Dome has an incredible track record. And frankly, I still hypothesize that we already have a missile defense system. I do honestly still believe that Ronald Reagan successfully at least started the Star Wars program if he didn't outright finish it. I think that's a thing that we have. This is probably just an upgrade, if I had to guess. But of course, Trump has to call it the Golden Dome. It does have kind of a ring to it, though. Um, and then also other modernization initiatives, which, hey, I'm one of those people. I don't know that I'd call myself hawkish, but I think when it comes to national defense, history has shown us that when you deprioritize it, bad things happen, and you don't realize it's going to be a bad thing until it's too late. So yeah, I'm actually all for this. And plus, in the scheme of the federal budget, like don't get me wrong, $150 billion is a lot of money, but it's not the biggest. Entitlements cost much more than that. I think the entitlements are in the trillions, like $2 or $3 trillion annually. So, but then the bill also allocates $70 billion to border control, sorry, including building more on the wall, expanding ICE and border patrol staffing, and detention beds, aiming to deport up to 1 million people per year. I don't inherently have a problem with this on paper, but we've seen what's happened with the Trump immigration policy, and they rarely do what they say they're going to do. And also, I have questions about detention beds. What does that look like? That's the only question I have. I'm not one of those people that's saying defund ICE, but I do think it should definitely be done differently. I think ICE does need more funding, but I think the priority of just deporting people is not only inefficient, but it's also a lot of times morally wrong. Because if you're just, this is why I inherently just despise quota systems, because when your only motivation is to get to numbers, you're not looking at the case by case basis the way you should. I have a problem when police departments have quotas for any reason. Quotas are bad. Goals are fine, quotas are bad. But even with goals, it just depends. But again, we'll see what happens with this because this in and of itself is not weird. This was coming in another bill if it didn't get through this one. So, you know, again, a lot of people are big mad about this, but it was coming. This is not a surprise. Some of the interesting parts of this bill, though, deal with energy and AI. So this one is super weird. The bill introduces an AI regulation freeze in the form of a 10-year moratorium on state and local AI laws, preventing individual states from regulating AI technologies outside of federal authority. That seems, I can understand their logic because the country is in a really competitive, how should you say, we're in a competitive contest with countries like China and for AI technology. And it, I can understand why you wouldn't necessarily want companies that are developing artificial intelligence to have to be beholden to 50 states worth of laws just at the federal level. But at the same time, first of all, this is most likely unconstitutional because it violates, state sovereignty. Um, but we'll dig into that a little later. And then we also have a lot of rollbacks on clean energy tax credits. It phases out or restricts IRS credits originally provided under the Inflation Reduction Act. And the Senate version softened repeal language to preserve some eligible projects. It's when Trump talks about this, he acts like he wants to get rid of all subsidies. And here's the thing, though. I'm not necessarily anti-subsidies, but I've always said this when it comes to green energy. If you want it to catch on, you need to incentivize people in their wallets. But new technologies are always expensive. That's the role of a subsidy. We're very close. In fact, I'd say we're probably there where new electric vehicles are on par, if not a little bit less expensive overall than their new gas-powered counterparts. Take my example. I drive a Chevy Volt. Now I bought mine used because they stopped making them in 2019. But I paid about as much as you would for a used car at that year mileage and all that. And it is a fiscal net benefit for me. I save money by driving that car. And, less emissions because it's not emission free, and it certainly it doesn't have a zero carbon footprint. But my motivation was the money. So I'm getting an immediate financial benefit, but there is an eco benefit as well. But it looks like they're getting rid of a lot of these. But they're keeping subsidies for coal and stuff like that. Which I guess if this were me and I were emperor and I would just give energy subsidies, period, to try to make energy more affordable. But part of that would be nuclear for sure. Part of that would be research and making. I'm not just giving away free money. Like the subsidies for green energy would be ways to make it efficient and cost effective. So, like for example, it's the cliche talking point now, but all the windmills and the wind farms, they put them all up, and then they figured out that that wasn't the most efficient form of windmill, but it's too late because all the contracts are already signed, money's already been sent. So, like, get some more R&D in this thing. And then education and student loans. Oh, they were so close. They were so close. They are phasing out subsidized undergraduate student loans, but that makes me think that unsubsidized are still available. I've been vocal about this. I think the federal government um, making money on interest on student loans is immoral and probably illegal, but it's certainly immoral. But I suppose this is less taxpayer funded. I mean, it's still taxpayer funded, but it's not taxpayer subsidized. Um, Lifetime borrowing caps are raised though, and many relief deferment options are curtailed. So you're getting rid of subsidized loans and getting rid of like this is not going to be good. It's not going to be good. And I already gave my solution to solve the student loan crisis. Trump didn't listen to me. But the video's still out there. You should watch it. You should definitely watch it. And then the AI analysis podcast did an episode that made me sound way smarter than I am, but I digress. For those of you who don't know, my proposal to solve the student loan debt crisis is the first caveat is the Department of Education no longer gives out loans, or at least they have a timeline to phase them out. Because it would be kind of shitty for, like, let's say this bill passed and this law came into effect in September, or that's a bad. Let's say it went into effect in March, right? And you got kids that are graduating high school, getting ready to call, and then they all of a sudden can't get a student loan when they've been told their entire lives that they're going to be able to get a student loan. So I get that, but I plan to phase out. But the key here is that you don't forgive the loans, but you do forgive the interest. So let's say you took out $40,000 in student loans, but your balance is now up to 80. That is a real thing that has happened to some people. Your balance goes down to 40, and basically you have the rest of your life to pay it off because since the government is no longer giving out these loans, they don't need coffers refilled. It's just a debt that needs to be paid back. Still agree with you can't, you can't bankrupt your way out of it, but you just got to pay back the original amount that you borrowed. I think that's more than fair. And then for those people that did pay back their student loans, they get a $10,000 tax credit. I think that's more than fair. So basically, you get 10,000 bucks for paying your loan off. So good for you. Everybody's happy. Also, Pell Grants are expanded to include vocational and workforce training programs. This is good. This I like. Let's see. There are some provisions for firearms. Suppressor tax is repealed. So basically, there was an additional tax on repressors when you bought one. That is now going to be repealed if this bill becomes law. And this is icky. Empowers Treasury to revoke tax exempt status of nonprofits determined to support terrorist activity. Sounds fine, except who decides what's terrorist activity? Because let's say that, oh, I don't know, the ACLU, who is fighting Trump left, right, and center. Well, now the executive can say that they're, attempting to curtail the government. So this could be bad. And probably the least. Okay, I take this back. This is certainly with Republicans. This is the least popular aspect. This bill increases the debt ceiling by $5 trillion. So a lot of fiscal, well, not a lot of fiscal, a few fiscal conservatives are really, really upset about this, namely Thomas Massey and Rand Paul, who did vote no, even when it all came down to it. Um, yeah, that's bad. That's bad. Oh well, the chickens will come home to roost eventually when it comes to the national debt. It's just we keep talking about it, and we keep kicking the can down the road, and one of these days you're not going to be able to kick the can because you're going to hit a wall or fall off a cliff. Fall off a cliff is probably a better analogy, but at least the can will be gone. All right, so just a quick recap for those of you that are just joining us. So again, in sort of rapid fire, uh, some of the key provisions are SNAP nutrition benefits and work requirements are increased, and some of the benefits are cut. Medicaid work requirements are added, and uh, Medicaid funding for abortions and gender care is banned in 2027. Eligibility reviews are sped up. SALT cap is $10,000, so state and local tax credit. And tips and overtime pay not taxed. Child tax credit remains at $2,500. $150 billion for the military, $70 billion for border security and the wall. And they're working to capacity to support 1 million people per year. It puts a 10-year limitation on state AI legislation, and many of the clean energy tax credits are rolled back. It is ending subsidized student loans, raising caps and Pell Grant expansion to the trades. It repeals the $200 suppressor tax and allows the IRS revocation of nonprofit tax status based on a terrorist or terrorist supporting designation. And finally, but certainly not lastly, the debt ceiling is increased by $5 trillion. So there's a lot of bad news in that bill, but I have some good news for you, particularly if you create content online like we do. Listen, especially if you're on YouTube, you know just as well as anybody that YouTube Shorts are if not your biggest growth tool. Problem is, editing good shorts takes time. You have to chop up all the long videos you've made. You have to decide what's good, what's bad. You have to edit it into that 9:16 format, and you got to add captions and it just takes a lot of time. Well, lucky for you, our friends at Wizard.ai can help, and they will save you a ton of time, just an absolute ton of time. It's breathtaking how efficient this is. So what you do, you don't even need to upload your video. You can just paste the YouTube link into their workspace, and you can set parameters, or you can just allow their AI engine to select the most viral clips of your long form video. It will auto edit and align. Now you can tweak it if you want to, because if you're like me and a control freak, sometimes you want to tweak it. It'll auto caption and churn out 30 to 40 shorts per your long form video. And in addition to all the editing it does for you, it will give you a viral score and explain why its AI thinks that this video has the potential to go viral. So you can make your decision and take individual clips that you want to upload, which by the way, you can auto schedule and upload through their workspace as well. Or you can just do a batch export. So you could theoretically have 40 short form videos in under 15 minutes, which is wild to me. Now, to be fair, there are other platforms that are similar, but I've never seen one that was nearly as good as AI, and their customer service response is top notch. It is incredible. I can't say enough great things about Visitor.ai, so you should click that link in the description and try it out for free today. I only ask that you please use the link in the description because it just tells Visitor that the Average Intelligence podcast sent you there. Alrighty, so there are some legal concerns, and they are valid. Why, yes. So we start with the big one. So the federal ban on state legislation on AI. Yeah, this is almost guaranteed constitutional, unconstitutional. Sorry. Most notably, federal preemption under the Supremacy Clause in Article 6 of the Constitution. It does allow Congress to override state laws, but it's not that simple. So in Supreme Court ruled in Murphy versus NCAA, which is only in 2018, that Congress cannot simply commandeer state governments by preventing them from legislating. So there's Supreme Court precedent there. And the provision may, in fact, be considered a prohibition of state legislative authority, which the court has deemed unconstitutional. So, technically speaking, it's not outright constitutional, but it's probably legally vulnerable depending on what they do. Which again, so if you have, I gotta think of an example. So basically, if you have a state that wants to pass a law regarding AI and they can't because the government's put a moratorium on it, I think you will have either this will end up being a Supreme Court case, is what I'm getting at. I think it's going to happen. And when it comes to the Medicaid work requirements, let's see. Multiple when it comes to the work requirements specifically, and I assume this would go for SNAP as well. Um, Multiple federal courts have already struck down similar work requirements, ruling that they violate the Medicaid Act's statutory purpose of providing health coverage, which makes sense. It's the reason the law exists. In Stewart versus Azar, the courts ruled that Health and Human Services acted arbitrarily in approving work requirements because they reduced coverage. So while Congress can change the Medicaid statute, if the work requirements cause a massive coverage loss, lawsuits are very likely. But it just depends on how many people lose their coverage due to these work requirements. What based on what I saw, they're just narrowing the pool a bit of people that are there. I'm sorry, they're expanding the pool of people who would have work requirements. So I'll be honest, I don't see this being a problem. Someone will probably sue, but in order for this to be a problem, they'd have to win. So we'll see. And then speaking of Medicaid, now we got the ban on gender affirming care and abortion. So, like I said, the law bans Medicaid funding of abortion except in cases of rape, incest, and life endangerment of the mother, which is the case in a lot of not all abortion legislation, but it's the case in a lot of them. And like I said, it bans gender affirming care starting in 2027. However, the Hyde Amendment already bans federal funds for most abortions. But as you know, this points out, it's a rider, it's not a permanent law. So this law most likely seeks to fix that sort of it might seem inconsequential, but it is. But the banning on gender affirming care is likely going to be called up on the Equal Protection Clause, and it violates Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, which prohibits discrimination based on sex, interpreted by some courts to include gender identity. So, and that would make sense in the case of that would make sense in this case because even though you may disagree with it, it is still an identity, and technically speaking, legally speaking, not technically speaking, that is a protected class. And in the case of Brandt versus Rutledge in 2023, courts blocked similar state level bans on transgender care under the under the Equal Protection Clause and lack of due process grounds. So, like I said, will it pass? I'm sorry, get triggered. I need to click a button here. I don't know. Well, it already passed the Senate. So I think it's going back to the House for revision. I'm not, oh yes, it has to go back to the House because the Senate made changes. So yeah, probably not tonight. Like I said earlier in the podcast that Trump was hoping to have this signed by July 4th. It, I think it will probably get signed, and I think there will probably be a handful of smaller changes, because they're really just trying to get this thing passed. They're not really getting bogged down in the weeds anymore. Trump has made it clear this is a huge legislative priority for him, which is ironic because he's the head of the executive branch, but I digress. It's a weird, I don't like how involved the president has become with Congress. I don't like it. It's icky. But so I predict this will get passed into law, but probably after the 4th of July, maybe the following week. Good luck with what, the podcast or the country? But anyway, like I said, where was I? So yeah. So the abortion funding ban is already in place. So through the Hyde Amendment, but the gender affirming care ban will probably be sued and overturned based on the Affordable Care Act and the in probably more importantly the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. And we come to that one. See this one. I'm sure the revoking nonprofit tax exempt status based on uh, Treasury Department determinations. Um, like I said in the bill, it's very vague. Who decides who supports terrorism? It brings up some pretty clear due process concerns. Violates the First Amendment potentially quite easily, and like in order to do that, the Treasury Department has to prove a clear violation of the law. But if the law says that if it's designated to support terrorists, then the violation is so vague that you can challenge it on, like I said, sometime depending on what it is, the Equal Protection Clause or the First Amendment, probably first and foremost. So this one, I would say it depends on how it's implemented, but if it is implemented with anyone, they're going to get sued immediately, citing the First Amendment, and it's probably not going to it's probably not going to slide. And then let's see yes, and then we come to the SNAP benefits for certain classes of aliens, and under the law, it's saying that to potentially exclude lawful permanent residents, asylum seekers, and other legal immigrant statuses. Citing the case of Graham versus Richardson, the court struck down state laws in 1971 denying welfare benefits to legal immigrants, ruling that classification based on alienage are inherently suspect under the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. And I can't agree more because that also flies in the face of the current immigration laws that are on the books. In fact, you can go onto USCIS's website and see all the restrictions on on receiving welfare, depending upon one's immigration status. Basically, if you're in the country illegally, you don't qualify for any federal welfare programs. Some people have been given welfare programs at the state level, but that's a state issue. Federally speaking, if you don't have legal status in the country, and even some legal statuses don't get it. For example, if you have a pending asylum case, you have legal status. If you had TPS, you had legal status, but you did not qualify for what would that be? You did not qualify for these sort of welfare benefits. Also citing the case of Plyler versus Doe in 1982, uh, this court decision held that undocumented children could not be denied public education. While not about benefits, this case does reinforce limits on punishing non citizens arbitrarily. So yeah, this is another case of it just depends on how it's implemented. But if they go too far, they're going to get sued, as they have been with virtually everything immigration related, because they're just pushing so fast. Another case cited, we already talked about that, the AI ban. Another case for that AI moratorium, though, New York versus the United States in 1992. This ruling reinforces the federal government cannot force states to legislate or prohibit them from legislating in areas not preempted by federal law. Now, theoretically, you could argue that this does preempt via federal law, but we'll see. We'll see. We'll see. But as I said, this is probably most likely unconstitutional because this is a total trampling of states' rights, whether you agree with it or not. And that's the problem with a lot of legal conversations in this country is people get confused with what's legal and then what they agree with. It's like I could absolutely love a law in concept, but it's illegal, or vice versa. I could absolutely hate a law, but it might be legal under the law. It's been a very big frustration for those of us who think that immigration is far too strict at the moment in certain areas. And as we're talking about Medicaid work requirements, the case of Stewart versus Azar again. This brings up coverage loss. Yep. And then the other case of Biden versus Becerra. Uh, Lower courts repeatedly ruled that states and Health and Human Services cannot enforce work requirements that lead to disproportionate disenrollments. So, once again, I'll reiterate it depends on how many people lose coverage based on these work requirements, but we shall see. It depends on what the motivation is, too, because if the motivation, which a lot of people are accusing Republicans of doing, if the motivation is to cut coverage legally, by mandating these work requirements, and then a lot of people lose coverage because they can't or won't meet them, which there is an important distinction there as to whether somebody doesn't want to meet them or if they can't meet them for various reasons. But I digress. Because of previous court rulings, it just depends on how many people lose coverage. Then we already talked about the banning of gender affirming care. And then some more specific cases on the whole Treasury Department being able to get rid of tax exempt status for nonprofits if they're if they're classified as supporting terrorism. Spicer versus Randall, and all the way back in 1958. Back then, everything was in black and white. The government cannot condition a tax benefit on the forfeiture of constitutional rights. In this case, First Amendment applies. So that case, pretty straightforward. But just in case that wasn't enough, here's another. Brandenburg versus Ohio in 1969 ruled that the government cannot punish speech unless it incites, quote, imminent lawless action. Now, this one's interesting because terrorism could be considered under this, but again, where's the line? It's this goes back to the whole January 6th thing. Legal incitement is really, really hard to prove, legally speaking, unless it's obvious. And that's kind of the point. So, yes, if you have an organization that is actively calling for terrorist action, that's pretty clear, cut and dry, and that's one thing. But if you have a case of like, and I do not agree with them, but if you have a lot of case of these pro-Palestine protests who are not, I mean, they are calling for genocide, but they're using coded language to do it. So they're not actually inciting violence in the legal sense. And because whenever they're asked over, it's like, oh no, we don't mean that, even though what we're saying is a rallying cry, but that's kind of beside the point. And then in 2010, Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project, upheld material support for restrictions for terror groups, but emphasized very strict standards. Upheld material support restrictions for terrorist groups, but emphasized strict. So that's dicey. I think what that means is that you can give money to them, but there are strict standards on how you can give money to them. I'm not sure. So basically, this is another one. It depends on how it's implemented. It just depends on if the Treasury Department, it just depends on if the Treasury Department just arbitrarily starts labeling nonprofit organizations that the current administration disagrees with as terrorist organizations. If that happens, they'll get sued and probably lose under the First Amendment. However, the Supreme Court has given some very surprising decisions as of late. But before we leave, I do want to talk about some of these Supreme Court decisions because another bold prediction: the Trump administration is fucking the Republican Party over in the future, and I will illustrate what I mean by that. So one of the more recent triumphs, in air quotes, is that the Supreme Court has recently ruled, for example, that a district court judge does not have the judicial authority to implement a nationwide injunction in a court case or a temporary restraining order nationwide. So, first of all, that's how a lot of things Biden was trying to do were curtailed through nationwide injunctions. This also opens up cases for, new DACA registration because that was kiboshed by a district court judge in Texas. But if those rulings no longer apply, well, DACA is going to open up. They're also going to get sued again for things like TPS. They're going to get sued so much now because since only people in the suing class have protection if granted a TRO, there's just going to be more lawsuits. There's going to be a ton more lawsuits. And we've already seen it. I predicted this, of course, not on air, so I'm not going to say I told you so because I didn't do this on air, but I did predict this. I was listening to some of the oral arguments that were being made when the Supreme Court was hearing arguments in that particular case, which, by the way, the lawyer for the federal government sounded like an idiot, but I guess the Supreme Court sided with them, so fuck me, right? But so they kept talking about the concept of like, well, okay, but so you would need basically a class action would be open. So sure enough, when this verdict got passed down, a lot of these organizations that already have pending lawsuits, mind you, it's just that they don't have the TROs in place. Well, they're now starting class actions. So now there's multiple lawsuits, and the only reason they're doing it is because the nationwide injunction does not stand. Therefore, I mean, trust me, when a Democrat gets elected into the White House in 2028, because it's going to happen, it's coming, um, they're really going to regret that decision. They truly are. It's things that happen like that where like way back in 2015, 2016, there was a conspiracy theory that Trump was actually just a mole for the Democratic Party who whose sole purpose was to ruin the Republican Party. And then when stuff like this happens, now to be fair, Trump's never really had that much of a track record of thinking super far in advance, and it shows here. But I don't know. This seems like he could be a mole. Seems like he could be a mole. But that is the gist of what's in the big beautiful bill. I recommend if you want more specific examples, just go read it because there's a lot of videos out there. I tried to be as nonpartisan here as I possibly could, just tell you what's in the bill and then give some perspective on the legal challenges. But everyone has biases. So if you want, I can't say I'm biased. If you want your biased opinion of the bill, you can go read it, read parts of it. You can use, an AI system to give you some bullet points. There's a lot of people talking about it, but as I said to get triggered a few moments ago, the bill is probably going to be passed into law, but probably after the 4th of July. And so YouTube has implemented this new things, experience points. I think this only works for Android devices though. But so the winner of tonight's live stream, the top fan spot, first place goes to Justin from the Spur of the Moment podcast. Get Triggered comes in just behind in second place. And Sosa Potence 300, our good friend, comes in third place with 25 experience points. So thank you for enjoying this episode of the Average Intelligence Podcast. Hopefully you're a little bit less average and a little bit more intelligent. Tonight you might actually be. Feel good about this one. But be sure to tune in next week when I do after the Jordan Peterson video. Clearly, I'm not going to say people liked it, but clearly people wanted to watch it. Candace Owens was just on there, but this time I'm going to do a blind reaction, but it's going to be in very much the same format. So stay tuned next week for that. And until then, just keep doing what you're doing. We just got to get through it. That's all. Have a